Thank you everyone for joining us today. Myself and Omar put this presentation together to kind of share our experiences and insights. We're seeing mixed-use developments starting to grow in urban centers. Our customers are asking us more and more to solve the problems for them with cost allocations in utilities. What they're asking us is for more complex metering solutions, as well as abilities to kind of reflect the usage of all the different constituents in those mixed use. Omar will take you through what does it mean mixed use, but I want to just kind of set the table why we're here. So I'm Kevin Neild. I'm from Enercare. Enercare is Canada's largest non-utility submeter provider. We got about over 100,000 customers, and we do submeter four different commodities. My colleague Omar Salihbegovic is from WSIPE Canada. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Kind of? Okay. Is from WSP Canada. They're one of the largest professional services firms with over 8,700 employees across Canada, and they're mainly engineers, technicians, scientists, and architects. Omar at WSIPE, he leads the team responsible for implementing, providing construction phase services, submetering designs for some of the GTA's largest mixed-use developments. So just a little bit about our partnership with WSP. We've had over a 14-year working relationship in both new construction and retrofit projects, with all commodities submetered with our partnership with WSIP. WSP provides Enercare with integrated service delivery for all engineering disciplines and project management, such as metering services working directly with our clients and our internal installation teams, post-implementation review and commissioning services. As well, they consult through an entire sales process with our customers. Now, on our side, Enercare is ultimately accountable for the relationship with our customers. We start with the whole submetering design. That's where we partner with WSIP to kind of get it right from the early stages. They actually partner with us through the installation phase. And then we take over on the customer enrollment piece, and then the ongoing monthly relationship with the landlords, clients, as well as the individual tenants, where we enroll, we monthly bill, and then ultimately we collect from the customers. We view this partnership as one of our competitive advantages versus our competitors as well. Okay. So let me get through kind of why you're all here today, and I apologize. I have notes here that I'm going to kind of make sure I stay on topic. There's several factors that directly influence the need for submetering and utility cost allocation in mixed-use developments. As we all know, commodities tend to be a large percentage of operating costs. Secondly, especially in mixed-use developments, there's typically one or two very, very large bulk bills. They're generally, 6 figures, and one entity ultimately has to be accountable to pay for that. And then lastly, commodity costs are continuing to increase. So there's always a need for everyone to start paying their fair share. I want to give you some empirical data just around where electricity prices have gone over the last since 2010 in the Ontario market. Since 2005, the Ontario government has created a regulated price protection plan, and that's actually allows the organization allows the industry to be stable with predictable energy pricing. The RPP, the regulated price plan, actually impacts the majority of multi-residential buildings and has seen a continued year-over-year growth. Over the last 8 years, the compound annual growth rate is roughly 9%. However, actually, as of Monday, May 1st, the RPP rates actually came down because the Ontario government introduced the Fair Hydro Plan. But had that not occurred, it would have continued to rise, as illustrated in my graph as well. Why is this important? The costs of commodities are actually outstripping the ability to increase the rents, and it's also the actual CPI, which some of the fees are anchored to as well, maintenance fees, etc. Since utilities and commodities are actually a significant cost of building owners, these increases will actually start eroding margins because the percentages aren't in step. Just lastly, before I kind of walk you through the agenda, is there is a lot of press right now going on in the markets about continued increased electricity prices, specifically here in the Ontario market. This actually has two impacts. Number one is probably a positive, is the consumers are getting more educated. They actually start to understand the drivers for escalation in electricity prices. Secondly, probably adversely, is these users now are more educated, and they're actually going to scrutinize invoices. They're actually going to scrutinize potentially unfair allocations if you're a commercial operation and you're actually doing it based upon a square footage. So with that in mind, there's two things here you have to consider if you are looking to do commercial submetering and allocation in buildings. Okay. Here's kind of the agenda we're going to walk you through today. So I'm going to hand it over to Omar right after this, and he's going to walk you through the technical design on mixed-use developments, a bit of background, what it means, some of the problems you encounter as you're going through this. I'll then actually walk you through the legal and commercial considerations. Once you've done all that, okay, you have to paper all this stuff and actually operate many, many years. So I'll actually walk through that. And then we'll actually share we'll call it a war story or a case study with a developer, which they're actually doing the right thing. Okay? So.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So my name is Omar. I work with WSP, and I wanted to start off by saying that I'm really excited to be here today. It's my first time at the Springfest conference, so to have an opportunity to sort of present on my work and my team's work at WSP and how we support Enercare and work with Enercare is quite an honor. As Kevin mentioned, he sort of described a bit of history of our longstanding relationship, and we're very thankful and proud of our relationship with Enercare. Enercare has become somewhat of a household name across all of the WSP offices here in the GTA. So they're one of our top clients, and they've stayed that way for a very long time. So as Kevin mentioned, I'll start off by sort of defining how we refer to mixed-use developments and what they mean to us when we talk about submetering. None of this should be new to anyone, because I'm presuming if you're in this seminar, you sort of have a good idea of what a mixed-use development already is. But we define them as buildings that blend residential and non-residential uses. So this could be, the most common case is a condominium combined with commercial spaces, a hotel, sometimes government as well. Physically and functionally integrated with pedestrian connections. So there's this idea of placemaking that makes mixed-use developments so appealing to me, actually. I read an article this morning in the Metro on my way to work about a new development that's going up or slated to go up in several years at Dufferin and Bloor, and the renderings look absolutely incredible. I love it because it's close to where I live, and so I know it's going to completely change that neighborhood. But this idea of public spaces that promote people's health, happiness, and well-being is placemaking. And so we're moving away from just building huge concrete towers where people hibernate during the night and leave desolate during the day, and we're building communities where people can spend time and they live there, but they also have fun there, and they see friends, and they take care of their health in a way. So these two block diagrams up here are examples of mixed-use developments and the sort of entities that could be involved within. They're both projects that we've worked on or are currently working on. So this blue one over here on the right side is one of the first mixed-use developments I would say we worked on with Enercare several years ago. And it's a great example. I'm going to bring it up a little bit later on during our case study because there's an interesting story behind that development. And then the development over here in green on your left side is one that's currently in construction in Yonge and Eglinton. So I'm going to draw your attention particular to the dark boxes, which mention shared facilities. So these are spaces that are shared between these multiple entities within the building. And that's really where the meat and the bones of the submetering designer's job is how do we make sure that we're submetering the shared facilities properly so that we can allocate the cost of consumption of these spaces to all of the entities that are using them. So just some trends here that I wanted to share with you for multi-unit residential buildings, or MURBs as they're called. So they're much less energy efficient than single dwelling homes. About 17% of annual utility costs can be attributed to water consumption. So this is a huge driving force behind why a lot of developers have turned towards domestic cold and hot water metering within their properties. Energy intensity since the 1970s is marginally increasing. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Rapid development of technologies in this millennial age. And suites that are not submetered individually on average tend to consume 12% more electricity and 15% more water. So what are some of the other driving factors? So utilities can account for 40 to 50% of condominium costs. A lot of developers are looking towards building greener buildings, and there's a lot of standards out there. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with these. LEED, the Toronto Green Standard. One that's not up here is Waterfront Toronto. So they're either, in a way by regulation being forced to make their buildings more energy efficient, or it's a way to make the buildings more attractive. There's this idea of energy literacy and empowering the end users to be more knowledgeable on what they're consuming and when they're consuming their energy. And so when we talk about submetering solutions, it's not the physical submeter that gets installed on site that is going to save the energy building. It's actually when the end users see the manifestation of those submeters. So they're hit with a fairly large bill initially, and they realize actually how much energy they're consuming, where they start to change sort of their habits to conserve energy and to save their pockets from spending too much. So that's the idea of energy literacy. And then I would say probably the biggest driving factor behind submetering solutions for mixed-use developments is this idea of allocation and transparency between all the entities. Kevin's going to talk about that further in his presentation, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it's definitely the key message of today's presentation. And then the ever so popular maintenance fees. So there's an article that came out in the Toronto Star a few years ago, and I don't know if any of you remember, but it basically stated that the average increase in maintenance fees for the first 3 years of a new condo are 14.8%, which is double the market average. And what's interesting when we look further is that amenities have a huge impact on maintenance fees per square footage, right? And so the reason this is so relatable to what we're talking about today is for a lot of mixed-use developments, these amenities are those shared facilities that I mentioned in the slide prior. So having a submetering solution that can separate these amenities and shared facilities so that they're allocated in a better fashion can decrease the cost per square footage of maintenance fees. So, talking sort of about the evolution of submetering technologies, and I won't spend too much time. I've put up a timeline here that starts in the 1990s and goes all the way to a few years from now in 2020. It all really started with electricity submetering, right? So it was something that we started seeing in the 90s and the 2000s, but it wasn't until 2006, 2007 where the Ontario government mandated that all of the new construction condominiums needed electricity submeters, that we really saw that it became a standard. And so now for sure, 100% of the projects that we receive from Enercare that we design for have electricity submeters. After that, it was domestic cold and hot water meters that became popular. And I would say that about 7 years ago or so was when we first really started working on our first new construction projects, where developers were requesting for water submeters as well. And now it's become somewhat of an adopted standard as well, to the point where I think about 80% of our projects have both electricity and water submetering. And then the final one that I want to mention here is space heating and cooling, or thermal submetering. So this is probably the most exciting one for us as designers, because it's the one that's probably the most complex to design. And the reason for that is space heating and cooling is a combination of water consumption, electricity consumption, and gas consumption that's being used up by the central plant. So how do we determine a rate for heating and cooling? Also, there's various heating and cooling systems out there for mixed-use developments. You have heat pumps, you have fan coils, you have IPS, right? And so is there one solution for them all, or do we sort of have to modify our design solutions to the particular project? Okay, let's talk about some of the design challenges. So I'm going to try and keep things high level because I know not everyone in this room may be a technical expert, but by any means, if there is an acronym or anything specific that I'm talking about that you don't understand, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to clarify it. So as designers at WSP for Enercare, probably the biggest challenge we face is the electrical mechanical base building designs for these mixed-use developments. And I like to group them into two categories, although there's combinations and a whole bunch of things in between. The first one is this scattered type of base building design. Okay, so think of this as a mechanical schematic or an electrical single line diagram. What you have in black is your utility demarcation point. So this is going to be a Toronto Hydro bulk meter, City of Toronto water meter, Enbridge gas meter. And then below that, you have all of your separate loads that belong to different entities sort of branched off from all over the place. So you can see the sort of light, but not the lightest blue, represents residential. So you have residential loads that are fed off the left side of the diagram there, and you have ones that are fed off the right side of the diagram. So in order to meter this type of property and separate the residential consumption, you would have to install 4 separate meters here. Whether that means electricity meters or water meters, gas meters, it doesn't matter, right? Whereas when all of the entities are sort of grouped together on the base building design in this fashion, it makes it much easier to submeter. Because you can see now that all we really need to separate the residential distribution is 1 meter right there on the left-hand side. And then we can get, if the client requires more granular information in terms of, okay, well, we don't want to only know what the residential portion is consuming. We want to know what Tower 1, Phase 1 of the project is consuming versus Phase 2 of the project. Then you can install submeters downstream of that and get more granular. But ultimately, this type of branch design makes it much easier to design the submetering system, as well reduce the cost of the material and the labor that's involved with installing these systems, right? So that scattered approach involves a lot of meters. So you can imagine a lot more costs of material and labor. Some other challenges. So I've split up projects into 2 categories here: new construction projects and retrofit projects. Lots of similarities, but lots of differences too from our perspective. I would say the biggest challenge in new construction projects is coordinating with all the parties that are involved in the project and having this future thinking mentality of, the developer initially is the driver of the project, and so they're going to be the ones that are making all of the decisions in terms of how we design the submetering system. But eventually, when the project is close to being completed or is completed, that project is going to be transferred to a condominium corporation who's going to be represented by property managers, and they're going to be the ones who are dealing with the design and the outcomes of the design, right? So having that mentality of considering the parties who are going to be involved in the project in the future as well is extremely important. And so coordinating and keeping all of that in mind is a big challenge for new construction projects. Also, integrating the design pre-tender versus post-tender, it makes it much more difficult for contractors to financially be able to account for what the system requires, as well as plan for their installations if they start seeing submeters being plopped on drawings after the project has already gone to tender and they're already halfway up the building, right? So ideally, we want to get in as soon as we possibly can prior to tender so that our submetering design and solution is shown on all of the specifications and drawings right from the beginning. And then the last point there, this sort of relates back to the thermal submetering that I was talking about previously, and some complexities when we have to meter the central plant in order to determine rates for heating and cooling. For retrofit projects, it's a little bit of a different kind of beast. And we're dealing with buildings that are already existing infrastructure that's already installed. So sometimes we're limited by space, by capacities. Also, Kevin's going to talk a little bit about this as well, so I won't digress too much, but there's existing billing allocation models. The most popular one is by square footage. So depending on whether the entities within the mixed-use development are benefiting from this type of model or not, that can present a challenge in terms of the submetering solution. Because if a commercial tenant, for example, a large restaurant, all of a sudden gets hit with a huge bill because they're now being submetered, they're probably not going to be too happy about that if they were benefiting on the fact that their footprint within the building isn't as great, right? And then load verification. So what I mean by that one is I have a little bit of an anecdote. We had a client come to us middle of last year. It's an existing mixed-use development on King West, and they have an underground parking garage. The first 2 levels is owned by a commercial parking entity, and then the lower 2 levels below that are the residential parking for the building. And so the parking garage was never sub-metered separately. It was all sort of metered together under one common area. And so they were allocating it based on square footage, which is all great and dandy until the condominium corporation decided to do a lighting retrofit in the 2 levels of their parking garage and swap their existing fixtures for LED fixtures. And now they're saying, well, you guys are using way more energy than we are in the underground parking garage, so you should be paying more. So the commercial parking entity then came to us and said, okay, we want to avoid any type of vague disputes in terms of percentages and square footages and all that sort of thing. Can you guys submeter our 2 levels of the parking garage separately so that we can pay for what we're using? So what we had to do is go into this property and literally account for every single load on the first 2 levels of the parking garage: lighting, exhaust fans, receptacles, ticket machines, all that sort of stuff, in order to do a proper submetering design. And we were able to do it for them. But again, it's a little bit of a longer process than it is for a new construction project when we're at the design stage with the base building consultants. So going back to this interdisciplinary approach and being very forward-thinking, there's 3 phases in a submetering design, or submetering project, I should say. So you have the design phase, obviously, and then you have the installation, which is the physical manifestation of what we've designed. And then you have the virtual manifestation of all of the design and installations, which is the billing allocation, which gets handed over to Kevin and his group at Enercare. And all of the entities here in black are involved at different phases of the project. You can see the building developer is sort of involved throughout the entire portion of the project. But what's really important to note here is that the submetering designer, so us at WSP, for example, when we work with Enercare, we're involved in every single phase of the project. Because there's been many occasions where a condominium corporation or property manager has come back to Enercare and asked them, well, why was it submetered this way? Why are we getting these bills for these spaces and not another set of bills for another set of spaces? And where are the meters? Why can we go and see them, and can we go and read them? And who better to answer those questions than the people who actually design the system? So that's sort of the takeaway from this schematic. And then for a retrofit project, you have a similar type of model, except there's no building developer involved. It's usually the property manager, the condo corp, who's driving the project from a client end. And then for now, I'll end on this slide, which is probably the most important slide for everyone in this room. If you're considering a submetering solution for your development, whether it's a development in the future or an existing one, what should you be looking for in a submetering partner? So again, what I talked about in my last 2 slides, that interdisciplinary approach, and someone who is going to design a system for you that's going to accommodate changes to your property in the future. This happens a lot of the time, right? When a building is built, it doesn't stay the profile of the building won't always stay the same way. So can we design a system that's going to accommodate those changes so you don't have to go through the entire process all over again when those changes occur? The actual submetering hardware that complies with regulations and standards. So for electricity and for gas, it's already regulated by Measurement Canada, so we don't have much room for leeway there. But for mechanical meters, for water meters and thermal meters, which may be regulated in the future, you want hardware that is going to withstand those regulations. And where Canada is going to be looking towards most likely is towards our international counterparts in Europe, which have been doing water and thermal submetering for much longer than we have. And some of the standards that they've adopted are NSF 61 and EN 1434 for that. So making sure that the mechanical meters meet those standards so that all of a sudden when Canada's regulating it, you're not having to rip out the meters and replace them. So a partner who can deal with complex billing solutions. Not every submetering provider may be able to provide you with the granularity you need to meter your shared facilities and allocate them in the way that you want. That's all I'm going to say for now, because Kevin's going to talk a little bit about it in more detail. And then turnkey solutions and strategic partnerships, these kind of go hand in hand. Someone who can do the design, provide the material, be there throughout the installation, someone who's going to maintain, reseal, recertify your meters when they go out of date, and someone who has their own customer client care department, and who has partnerships in the same way that Enercare does with professional engineering firms such as WSP or meter manufacturers. And then the last one is someone who has a strong market presence. When we're talking about mixed use, we're talking about multiple entities. So you do not necessarily want someone who has only experience in residential. You want someone who has experience in commercial, in hospitality, in healthcare, and government, etc. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Kevin.
So if you're considering a submetering mixed use development, as Omar pointed out, you really got to think of the cost utility allocation in advance. It's definitely a measure 3 times cut once proposition. Electrical and metering design can be different, as Omar mentioned, when you actually have to consider, so Omar spoke to the different parties, but in that blue diagram he put up, you actually have multiple legal entities as well. And you have to have the foresight to know, okay, I'm going to have different legal entities now, and I actually have to think about the collection process with those different entities and their risk types as well. If you do avoid cost allocation as an afterthought, and you eventually, a lot of people in here may have inherited a building, et cetera, it wasn't contemplated back then, you will actually, if you do it on a retrofit path, you will have to make concessions as you're going, just because when the original design, it didn't actually contemplate these multiple entities and splitting loads. I think your example about the parking garage or a restaurant who has a very large gas usage that's actually getting subsidized by a common or shared facility is a good example where that probably wasn't originally contemplated when they designed that location. With the actual allocations and for the shared facilities, you can't submeter in everything. That will actually get very costly. So you do actually have to come up with some type of sharing formulas. Those could be, as Omar mentioned, and probably a lot of us are familiar with, is a pure simplistic square footage allocation. You can get a little more sophisticated. You could actually start thinking about, okay, well, how will this space be used? For example, if you have a commercial and a retail space in there and you actually have a TTC access, maybe they get a higher percentage of the allocation because you foresee them using more of that shared facility. The other thing Omar mentioned, and you should consider, if you're doing allocations, you are not required to use Measurement Canada or certified equipment. Our recommendation is you take that out of the equation for any future disputes. You actually go with a higher standard. You don't want to call into question the accuracy of your data or faulty equipment. So, our recommendation, on the for the commodities, electricity, gas, you should be using Measurement Canada certified equipment. For thermal and water, Omar mentioned some of the standards out there for certification bodies as well. The rate setting and admin fees. Early on, if you're doing a retro or even a construction project, you need to have those conversations early. The more you submeter, the more meters you put in there, that's going to cost you. And how an organization like ours, or if the developer pays for the meters or the condo board, they have to recoup that capital investment somehow, and it's potentially through the administration fees. So you need a return on the capital deployed, but you also need the ongoing operation and maintenance costs of having those meters there. So it is a bit of a design decision, and it's a trade-off as well. Okay. The other thing we got to consider, and I am by no means a Bill 135 expert, which is the energy and water reporting benchmarking, but I wanted to kind of just highlight the future is going to be around, I'm going to say global warming and trying to basically making sure you're able to measure your usage. This here, I pulled out some relevant dates for some of these entities, because it's not the building, it's actually the legal entities within the buildings that actually have to report. And so I threw up some of the dates there. So if you have foresight and you start knowing this, you can actually, with a good allocation and a kind of a pay-per-use model, you can start reflecting the usage of your legal entity. So if you're a condo board, you want to make sure, okay, we're all paying our fair share. Couple things, if you don't have a good metering design solution, or you're not able to really, truly identify your usage, you may miss out on potentially future benefits the government or may provide. The other side, you could get punitively hit. You could get hit by future, I know cap and trade's coming. There could be other environmental type taxes that if you can't demonstrate savings year over year by some type of demand, you won't be able to tap into those programs, so you could get taxed as well. Something to consider as well, okay? So everything Omar kind of walked you through eventually has to be put into paper through legal contracts. I'm going to be honest with you, these take a lot of time, okay? And so having good design in the beginning can definitely save you a lot of pain down the road. So the shared facilities, and Omar highlighted kind of those blue boxes in his diagram. Those ones you really need to spell out exactly your allocation methodology. And I actually recommend you make really specific details rather than broad statements we typically see in condominium agreements or in shared facility agreement. You want to be very specific around that. Detailing the complex cost allocation formula will actually give anybody in the future insight how the ratios were developed and what the intent of the ratio was. Okay? This also keeps, for when Enercare actually takes over and we're or potentially our competitors, it gives them clarity in the operating rules, because they actually have to live out that agreement. And these agreements are pretty long-term as well. All these agreements, in these mixed use, there is multiple agreements. You got to make sure they reference each other. You got to make sure the condo, the condo corporation agreement references shared facilities agreements reference the condominium agreements as well. The submetering provider is in these developments for the long haul as well. So what you have to contemplate is the exit strategy should the agreement go to term, or for whatever reason, sometime in the term, there is a bit of an unraveling. Because they're intertwined with all the legal entities, you have to give that a lot of thought. Okay, what is the exit strategy? Do they buy the equipment? Do we own the equipment? How do we actually go through that process? So you do have to think about that early on when you're drafting your legal documents. Freehold lease agreements also need to be considered. These will get a portion of that shared charge as well. So you got to make sure in those agreements you actually reference those. The other thing is defining recourse for non-payments, whether it's with your submeter provider or actually in all the different agreements as well. What is the recourse if they don't adhere to the timelines? And then lastly is, Omar pointed the diagram, there's one big massive bulk bill, maybe there's two. Somebody, legal entity, has to be accountable to pay that. You will have working cash flow issues or working capital issues if one entity, who is maybe one of the smaller users, has to pay that. A good submeter provider would actually take on that responsibility, but they're an agent. They're actually not legally accountable. They're just an agent that's accountable on behalf of condominiums. So you got to make sure you craft that in. Our recommendation, if you have the foresight, is give the entity who would have the largest share, make them accountable to pay the bulk bill. So if you've got multiple towers and they're actually one condominium, that entity should pay, and then you're expecting cash receipts from everybody else on that bulk bill. So you've actually got a good design. you've papered everything perfectly. The last piece is there's people involved. And this is where you really need good relationship management to make all this work. You're going to have lots of different constituents. So you're going to have condominium boards. You're going to have very sophisticated procurement professionals from retail entities, commercial entities. All these individuals have to understand this. This is where a submetering provider should make the investment and work with the different constituents to really get them up to speed to understand what the actual document is, what the actual documents are. If you have proper design and clear legal documents, it will actually be very helpful in actually providing onboarding materials, actually providing training materials, so everybody understands how they're getting allocated, how their costs are being downloaded, potentially through maintenance fees, et cetera, so everybody understands that. Regular communication is also important, because if you don't have the regular communication, condo boards change in and out, retail owners move around. You have to have the continued ongoing communication with everybody so they really understand the program as they move forward. So what do we want to do? We actually want to walk you through a case study. Omar's going to do the majority of the work because it's quite technical, but he's actually brought it to a level that I can understand it, because I'm just the billing guy. So Omar will get us there. So this is a developer we worked with who actually is doing it right, but actually they had a lot of lessons learned, and now what we're showing you is the right way, in our opinion, to actually design and construct a multi-use insured facility.
Thank you, Kevin. So I do want to go back to that point there and just preface this case study by saying that blue block diagram that I initially showed on my slide is the project that Kevin's speaking about, where this particular client, which is a very long-standing client of Enercare's, learned the hard way that they should employ more of a comprehensive submetering solution for their project to avoid some of the disputes that they were experiencing. And the reason they were experiencing that was because they retained ownership of the property once it was completed. They actually had their development office on the property, and they were the actual commercial parking entity on that project. And so, 5 years after the project had been completed, maybe even sooner than that, they started to, get into some disputes with the hotel management, with the condominium corporations or whatnot. So this time around, for their current project, which we are working on, it's in active construction right now. They came to Enercare and said, okay, let's avoid all of those issues that we experienced on our past project and make sure we do the submetering design properly for this project. So I'm going to put up here the load profile sort of what the building looks like. So you can see there's quite a large residential component to the building, and then you have a fairly large commercial component, which is in orange as well. There's a large grocery store that's going in on the second floor. You have a retail concourse that's on the first level. And then again, I'm going to mention it, it's super popular for mixed-use developments, is this idea of splitting the parking level into a commercial parking entity and residential parking entity. And then the most fun and complicated one is the one in purple, which is our shared facilities, which we've sort of mentioned ad nauseum throughout the presentation. So what was our first step? So our first step when Enercare handed the project over to our design team was to sit down and meet with the developer and come up with this space plan allocation. So for every single space within the property, we sat down with the developer and said, who's using the space and what's within the space. So just as an example here, I've taken the P1 level for you and sat down to meet with the developer, and they told us the lower portion of the P1 garage is purely residential. So only the suite owners will be parking in these spaces and will be using those corridors and rooms that are just above there. Then we have these 3 elevators on the P1 level, which are considered commercial common area, meaning that these elevators only service the commercial tenants, the grocery stores and the retail concourse. So that should be something that's allocated to all of the commercial entities within the project. Then we have a separate commercial common area that just services the first floor retail concourse, so has nothing to do with the grocery store on the second floor. In red, I believe that is either a freight elevator or a garbage room, not sure, but it's a shared facility that's being shared between residential and commercial. So that also has to be separately submetered and allocated. And finally, if you didn't guess already, there's our commercial parking. So these are parking spaces that are going to be used just by the retail tenants or their customers. So this is what we did for every floor and space within the project. So our next step was to take this space plan allocation and meet with the developer's mechanical and electrical base building consultants and say, hey, we've allocated all of the spaces within the property. Now we have to take a look in more detail what belongs to those spaces from an energy consumption perspective. This example here is just for electricity, right? So taking that garbage room or freight elevator space that's a shared facility, where are the lights within that room being fed from, where are the receptacles, exhaust fans, all of those types of loads, and sort of putting them in this summary chart. So under each of the headings, you have your separate common areas, and then you have all of your loads, what panel they're associated to, what circuit they're associated to, and where the meter and what meter numbers are going to correspond to each one of those loads. Okay, so that's the big coordination bit that I was talking about earlier for new construction projects. It involves a lot of coordination between the consultants and the developers. And then we take all of that away and we generate our drawings and specifications. So what you see here on the left-hand side is a snippet of the electrical consultant's single line diagram. And then what you see up there in the gray boxes is that actually Enercare's electrical submeters, and what panels exactly they're associated to, and then the numbers inside the boxes that are all color-coded are individual meter registers. And those colors correspond to all of those entities in a few slides before. So different common areas and different spaces that are either shared or dedicated. And then what you have on the right-hand side is an example in a little bit more detail of what the actual submetering system is going to look like. So this is going to be primarily used by the contractors to sort of understand how the system is going to be installed and how it functions, as well as some notes and specifications below. So this is something that we would ideally add into the base building drawings, ideally pre-tender, so that everyone has an understanding of what's involved before we start delivering electrical distribution equipment to site and beginning our installations. So once the meters are installed, hopefully as they're designed, then we hand it over to Enercare and Kevin's team to do the rest.
So what we're depicting here is basically a summation of all the different meter points. As Omar threw up that line diagram summarizing all the different loads and circuits, this is a summation of all the different meter points. So the COM, kind of the orange, green, and blue there, those COM meters are directly metered. So we would issue a bill directly to those tenants or owners of those spaces. The JCBMs is joint common area. So there would be in the legal agreement some type of sharing formula for those ones. So we would either on behalf of them split that invoice. I'm not sure where this one's at, but I think these ones we're actually splitting on behalf of the landlords. We're actually taking that joint and we're actually issuing it separately to the two entities. And then you actually have the common areas as well. As Omar mentioned, we also would send invoices directly to those condominium corporations for those common areas. How we actually come up with the rates. So this is very simplistic the way we put it here, but actually getting the rates, this is all put in our system. We actually have to take the bulk bill. So all these service periods have to line up. I get that bulk invoice. I actually take the rate off that bulk invoice, and then I have to basically crank it through our system to get all the residents. Remember, we have residents here. All those ones are separately metered. Everybody who's positively metered separately, then will actually get subtracted from these boundary meters to actually come up with the remaining allocation. And then I'll use my rates to actually allocate these to all the individual units. Okay? So that kind of wraps up our presentation. I am going to open up the floor if you have any questions. There's a lot to cover here. I'm going to have to repeat your questions because we're taking that as well. So I just open up the floor if you have any questions for myself or Omar. At the back there.
We're helping a property manager that has a large industrial site with a series of offices and smaller industrial sites next to it with an apartment complex. And so the main industrial consumer, we're going to be installing an on-site power generator, selling them the electricity at 15% less than the grid, but the other players are not interested. So the main industrial site will lower, we're going to lower their bills by 15%. But the other, and the apartment complex may be interested, but they're afraid of the high cost. They said that submetering companies have gone to them. It's too high of a cost. So this is our first project like this, and I know we're going to get a lot more. Is there a way for you to provide a quote that is not invasive, or do you need us to get the whole electric single line diagram for you? Or do you have people that would come to the site and sit down with us at the round table?
Great.
So I can't really speak on the cost aspect of it, but in terms of being able to generate a cost from Enercare's perspective, having an understanding of the design definitely helps. I think it's the most important thing. So how we've done it in the past is clients have approached Enercare, requesting a quote for a similar type of project that you're describing. Now Enercare will actually have us from WSP come in, take a look at the design and see what would be involved from a metering perspective, and then they can take that into consideration and envelope that with all of the other costs that are involved with billing and what Kevin's group does to generate a final quote. Right?
Yeah, correct. Yes, a lot of the...
It could be the company that pays for it as opposed to having the client who paid for it.
Yeah.
Because the client's not even paying for the generation of our investors are financing it. So
Yep.
it could be 50,000, it could be 5 million. Actually, we're doing a high-rise condo that's over 5 million. So we'll pay for it all.
Yep.
But we need to know to get a quote. Could you come to the meeting, or is it I'm
Yep.
sending you an email or something? Could you come to the site and to generate a quote? You have to do a tour, site visit.
Site visit for sure, and then the more data if you're going to go down this path, you're going to have to get some form of electrical, maybe not diagrams, but even at least an inspection, right, to go through that aspect.
Yeah, if we're talking about electricity, then a single line diagram that's fairly up to date, and a simple review on site would suffice. If we're talking about mechanical submetering, then a little bit more is involved. So mechanical schematics, floor plans, all that sort of stuff would be required.
What I can do is I can take your card and I'll follow up with you after, because then you look like you have a lot more questions. So I'll follow up with you after as well. Okay, sir.
Yeah, probably a question relevant to both of you.
Okay.
So I work with a solar energy provider here in Toronto, and we deploy systems that are under the new net metering program. So that's not a feed-in tariff program where you just sell electricity to the grid. With net metering, you're actually able to produce energy and consume it on site in your own building. In excess, you get fed back to the grid and effectively run your meter backwards. So you get a credit on your utility. What I'm curious about is there any way through submetering where a landlord who wants to make this type of investment in their building and they're submetered, where they are able to kind of recover some of that benefit that would go to the tenant via submetering arrangement? So, for instance, the net bill that the building would receive from the hydro company the other month would be net of any generation that they fed back into the grid. I'm wondering if there's a way through submetering that you can sort of recover some of that benefit from the tenants as well. That's something you guys have looked into.
So it's very similar to a cogeneration type application, right? So we've actually worked with developers and retrofits looking at some cogeneration. So they're obviously using gas and they're actually running generators. So take out the gas, you're actually deploying solar. But it's the same application. So we work with them, we submeter and we isolate that load. What actually happens then is the actual demand from the grid actually goes down as well. So you're actually lowering that grid, but you want to get credit because you've actually made the capital, whether it's in that cogen facility or in the solar arrays. You actually want to get some type of return on that. Hey, I've actually enabled you to save, and you probably want to earn that spread. And that's the application we've been working with developers, is the spread between what would you have paid versus what am I supplying it for from the gas. And you actually want to, that's why you're doing it, you want to earn that spread. So absolutely can be done. It's just got to partner with the right individual. So I view that very similar to a cogen. Omar, if I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Okay. Yeah. Sir.
I'd like to comment on the proprietary versus generic type metering in the building. So once you get into the building is married to you for life or for a long period of time. But if you want to change the provider, how do you do it? How do you go about this? How do you deal as a consumer
to switch over the provider?
I'm the property manager.
Yep.
I'm facing the grievance that occurs when you send the bills that are not accurate, or they are late, or they are
So I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give you illegal advice. So all I'm going to say is,
from the technical standpoint, let's say.
so I'm just going to read it. So the question was, how do you actually switch out your provider? Now, is there technical deficiencies maybe they're not meeting, or maybe want to do retrofit?
Well, it's just that from the standpoint of the customer service, there is not all the tenants of the contract are met. Yep. So you are facing divorce. How do you do it practically?
So at the end of the day, it's going to come down to what is your exit clause, and I mentioned that earlier. You got to have these exit agreements, right? So what is the provider you're working with? Are they in breach? Was there certain timelines? They have to provide accurate bills on a timely basis. Do you have clauses in there that allows you to issue notice to them? Say, you know what, you're in breach. You got to clean this up. You got to remedy the situation. Can you put penalties on them? I don't know your specific situation, but typically in those submetering contracts, there is termination clauses for breach of contract as well.
But I'm more interested in
the technical.
Technical part,
okay.
Because the legal part.
You got that.
Lawyers
That's right.
On. But when inviting the competition, they just say, "Oh, I cannot touch that because I cannot calculate the terminal the way it is calculated now."
Okay, so from a technical perspective, how we would deal with this is uniquely enough, if WSP is involved, we're not a competitor to any submetering provider, right? So we're a professional and consulting firm. So we've had a few cases where multi-commercial entities have come to us that already have an existing submetering system installed and want to upgrade their system, right? And so what we would do in those instances is we would do a fairly comprehensive site assessment where we would walk around and take a look at the existing system, what it's metering, has it been recertified, is it up to date, is it accurate, that sort of thing, and then generate a report and preliminary design that either recommends, retrofitting the existing system and bringing it up to speed, or completely canning it, which we have recommended in the past, and putting in a brand new submetering system. My blanket statement is always you can submeter everything, but until you have an understanding of what the building looks like, the age of the equipment, space, capacities, all that sort of stuff, you won't really know what you can do until you go there and look. And we have that capability, right? Because we're an engineering firm to go and do those types of assessments, and we partner with Enercare and we know their capabilities. So, we sort of know what you can do and what you can't do. So hopefully that helps answer a little bit.
Anything else? Any other questions? Sir.
Two questions. One for Omar,
okay.
One for Kevin.
Okay.
So Omar first. Sure. I was a little surprised to see the trend for MERV's energy intensity going up, according to the graph that you showed. I'm just wondering if you talk to why you're seeing that trend and what are the drivers, and if how new buildings and new developments fall in relation to that average. And then the second question is on the thermal submetering side, where are we on that trend? Are we very early, or is it just a couple developers that are looking at it, or is it a little bit more advanced?
Good question. Do you want to?
Sure. So the energy intensity is, I grabbed that actually from a report, from a government report, and so I don't know the reason why. I mean, it has been increasing, I think, over time, and so technology has something to do with that. Also, for multi-unit residential buildings, sometimes cost of construction is a big factor that's taken into consideration, and so we're not building buildings that can be more energy efficient and decrease that intensity because we're taking a priority of cost priorities into account before we take that into account, right? Putting in equipment and mechanical systems, right, that may not be the most efficient because we want to preserve the costs associated to it.
Do you want to comment on the technical, the thermal piece? I'll give you my insight from a business, but the technical.
So, okay, so for thermal metering, sort of where we're at, was that your question? From a technical perspective, or?
Yeah.
Right. So I definitely, we're past the phase of it's an emerging technology. It's now more trending, and we're seeing a lot more of it. I mentioned earlier on in my presentation that it's a little bit more complicated because it's not associated to one utility. It's not water, gas, electricity. It's a combination of all of those and what the central plant within the building is consuming. So that's why the designs for thermal submetering look a little bit different. It's not just a flow meter that's being installed inside of a fan coil unit or a heat pump. It's a combination of larger flow meters at the exit and entrance point of the central plant to calculate the overall thermal consumption, and then additional water, gas, electricity meters so that you know what the cost of your central plant is. So now you know the cost of your central plant, you know the total consumption, you put one over the other, you now have a rate that you can apply to your individual thermal meters. With that come certain complexities, right? Because heat pumps exchange energy. So are you really measuring the consumption of the central plant, or are heat pumps exchanging energy with each other? Right, that example where you have a grocery store, in the wintertime, your grocery store is going to be consuming a lot of cooling still. Your residents are not. They're going to be using heating. So if there's a heat pump system in there, they're going to be exchanging, and there's various complexities, and that's why a thermal submetering design for a particular building will look very different from the thermal submetering design at another building, right? It's very project specific.
I'll just give you my insight, what we're seeing with our clients as they're questioning. It, as Omar explained, I'm sure, I'm a dollars guy. It's a very expensive solution. And so when we're working with clients, we're really upfront with them, said, if you really want to do this, it's going to be very expensive. And eventually your tenants, or if it's in a condo, they're actually going to be burdened with that cost. We have a couple of projects. We did a geothermal, et cetera. So great decision from an environmental perspective, but it does. You need to get that return on your capital. So we're seeing it. We do it. It's a lot of queries. I still think the technology is there. I just don't think we're getting economies to bring that price point down. Right, so it's like anything that's brand new. You really got to get the economies. You got to start getting everybody to do it. Bring that price point down, and then we can start rolling it out. It's right now. I think we're still in that the curve. We're still going up emerging technology. Yes, we got to figure it out, but it's still quite expensive to do. Okay.
But I see that as an opportunity. We pay for it, isn't it? Does it look like a?
Well, if you pay for it, that's fine. But
we're going to become the utility provider for the building. So obviously, our investors would pay for it.
Yeah, if so, that's the thing. If we're entering an arrangement where somebody says, we want to pay for all this, yeah, that's fine. But then how are you going to get your return?
We're selling electricity 15% less than the grid, but it costs us a fraction.
Oh, for that specific, thermal's completely different animal, though, right?
No, gas heat pumps. We do heating. So we can retrofit the building with a gas heat pump. It's 70% less than electricity costs. We'll pay for that. It just seems like an obvious thing. Other countries are doing it.
Yeah.
Ontario is so slow.
I can't disagree with you there. Good comments. Okay. Just before we wrap up and get the sign in the back there, if you guys want a copy of the presentation, if you could give us your business cards up here, we'll be happy to email that. And I think we got a couple of Enercare people here as well walking around if you got any questions for us, okay? Thank you very much.